CEV Group welcomes you for watching this video. Please do not forget to like, comment and subscribe our registered values club for getting all new professional updates. In this video, we will discuss about the valuation as per National Disaster Management Authority guidelines. Whenever some disaster happens, and after that, many buildings and other infrastructure is affected, then we will discuss about how we can do valuation of such affected buildings and infrastructure. And second thing we will discuss about, as you know, the various banks have already added another thing in their valuation format, that a valuer has to give details about the construction of building, whether it is as per the Ndma guidelines or other Indian standard codes. The construction whether follows the Ndma guidelines and other Indian standard codes or not. So we will discuss all the things which are necessary from valuation point of view, and also whenever you have to do valuation, then what are the things you must check, that to make that the building of which you are doing valuation, whether it is following the Ndma guidelines or not. So in this video, we will be discussing about the valuation of land and building as per Ndma guideline. In the aftermath of disasters, accurate valuation of land and buildings becomes critical for fair compensation, insurance claim processing, and rehabilitation efforts. The National Disaster Management Authority, we simply call NDMA of India, has established comprehensive guidelines that governs the complex process of valuation. So these guidelines ensure standardized approaches to valuations that consider disaster-specific factors, regulatory requirements, and technical parameters. This presentation provides a detailed overview of the NDMA valuation framework, its implementation, and best practices for the practitioners in the field of valuation. So, what is NDMA? What is its role? And other things about NDMA we will discuss in this slide. And this NDMA, it is apex body for disaster management. It was established under the Disaster Management Act 2005 as India's apex body responsible for developing policies and guidelines for effective disaster management. So what it does, it develops comprehensive policies, plans and guidelines for disaster management, mitigations, preparedness and response. And it promotes disaster resistant structural and non-structural measures in all the potential development projects, including standards for constructions in hazard-prone areas. So this thing is important from valuation point of view, that infrastructural resilience means construction and taking all structural and non-structural measures in developing projects, and then also formulating standards for constructions in hazard prone areas. So the NDMA, in close coordination with the State Disaster Management Authority, simply called SDMAs, and District Disaster Management Authorities, simply called DDMAs, to ensure implementation of guidelines at all administrative levels, creating a multi-tier approach to the disaster resilience. So, as far as national disaster is concerned, it has NDMA has formulated a national policy of disaster management. So it is NDMA NPDM, National Policy of Disaster Management. It was enacted in 2009. So what it does, it established the legal framework for disaster management in India, emphasizing prevention and mitigation of disasters. And it is the NDMA which reviews periodically the various things under this NPDM Act. So regular assessment of implementation effectiveness and identification of safety gaps is being done, and wherever required certain amendments are being done in the act, so as to have integration of new technologies, construction methods and climate change considerations. And as far as front stress is concerned, it provides a comprehensive guidelines for disaster planning, response, and recovery, including valuation protocols. So the NPDM serve as the foundation for all disaster management activities in India, providing a holistic approach to in disaster risk reduction. So the policy emphasizing building safer, disaster resilient communities through proper planning, prevention, and mitigation measures. So now we will discuss about the importance of valuation in disaster management. So how important is valuation in case of disaster management? So whenever some disaster happens, so then if the property has been insured, then the insurance company have to give compensations to the affected person whose properties have been affected by the disaster. So to have certain procedures for giving compensation and processing the insurance claims, certain things have to be incorporated so that valuation is done accordingly, and neither the client and nor the insurance company are at the loss. So basically, we have to ensure a proper compensation framework. So NDMA provides standardized methodology to determine fair compensation amounts to the property owners affected by disasters, ensuring equitable distribution of the relief funds. So it also serves as a basis for the processing insurance claims, resolving disputes between claimants and insurers through objective assessment procedures, and at the same time, it helps in rehabilitation planning. So it guides resource allocation for rebuilding infrastructure and housing while quantifying the economic impact of disasters on the communities. And it also takes into consideration the future risk mitigations. So it identified vulnerabilities in the existing structures, informing policy revisions and building code improvements to enhance disaster resilience. So proper valuation helps in transform disaster recovery from arbitrary relief distributions to a systematic process that address both immediate needs and long-term resilience goals. So it creates accountability and transparency in allocation of limited recovery resources. So as far as NDMA governance is structure is concerned, first of all we have central NDMA. So it is chaired by Prime Minister and it develops policies and guidelines for the nations. So then comes the state disasters management authorities. So what it does, it implements the central policies and with state specific applications. So each state has its own disaster problem. So each and every state implements central policies as per its own specific adaptations. Then comes district disaster management authorities, which coordinates implementations at local level, and the last one are urban local bodies, which execute the valuation and building regulation enforcement. So the multi-level governance structure ensures that disaster management policies flows from the central planning to the local implementation. Urban local bodies play a critical role in valuation process, working directly with the affected property owners while following standardized guidelines established by the higher authorities. So, what are the key legal instruments which are important for a value to know? First thing is National Disaster Management Act 2005. So, it is a basic foundation of all the acts. So, foundational legislation providing legal authority for disaster management activities, including valuation protocols and compensation frameworks. And then the main thing which as an engineer or as an architect you have to deal with is knowledge of National Building Code 2016. So it is basically comprehensive building standards that integrates disaster resilience requirements into construction policies and serves as a reference for valuation. And then each state has its own building bylaws, so you must know the state-specific building bylaws of the state in which you are doing valuation work. So local adaptations of national standards that address region-specific hazards and construction requirements. So these legal instruments work in concert to create a comprehensive regulatory framework for disaster-resilient construction and fair valuation. They establish mandatory standards that must be considered during property assessment and provide legal basis for enforcement actions. So now we will discuss what are the valuation objectives under NDMA guideline. First thing is whenever there is some disaster and because of this disaster there are certain uh, loss of some building and infrastructure, then compensation has to be paid. So these guidelines provides procedure for equitable compensation so as to ensure fair and consistent financial relief based on standardized methodology. And it also help in risk reductions as it promotes rebuilding practices that minimize future vulnerability, thereby having facilitating rapid rehabilitation of affected communities, and it also provides guidelines for creating comprehensive record of disaster impacts for policy development in the future. So the NDMA valuation guidelines aim to balance immediate humanitarian needs with long-term resilience goals by providing a structured approach to the property assessment. They have to convert subjective damage observations into objective financial valuations that support both compensation and reconstruction planning. So, when is valuation required under disaster? First thing is post-disaster assessment. So immediately following the disasters, it is our aim to determine the extent of damage and compensations requirement for the affected property. And time, second time where the valuation is required is to determine the displacement and relocation costs of the population. So when the population need to be moved from high risk areas to the safer locations, it requires fair valuation of both existing and the replacement properties of the affected persons. And then after the disaster, when there are certain insurance claim, for insurance claim processing, you need the verification of damage claims filed by the insurance providers, ensuring accurate assessment of covered losses. And then you need valuation when you have to make certain rehabilitations of the affected persons, such as providing them housing and rehabilitation loans for construction of houses. So when financial institutions require valuations before approving reconstruction loans for disaster affected property. So these are the things where you need valuation for disaster. So valuation procedures are typically triggered by formal disasters declaration from the appropriate authorities. The scope of detailed valuation may be vary based upon disaster magnitude, affected population size, and available sources for assessment. So you know basic things are already known to you, but again we will be repeating the basic things which you must know as a value. First thing is whenever you do valuation, whatever type of valuation is, you have to find out the fair market value of the property. So same thing is there. You have to find the fair market value of the property. So the your approach is to find fair market value. So the NDMA guidelines recommend using pre-disaster fair market value. See here, you have to find the pre-disaster fair value, fair market value as the baseline for land valuation, adjusted for disaster impact factors. So the approach considers recent transaction prices of comparable land, government circle rates for the location, income potential of the land. So first thing is based upon these things, and then you have to consider land use. So what type of land use to which the property or the land can be put to. So we must take into account the officially approved land use classification which significantly impact value, whether it is a residential land use can be used for residential or commercial or agricultural, or it can be converted into other asset classes. So you have to take into consideration whether it falls in special economic or industrial zones or in restricted, it have a restricted use due to environmental regulations. So the NDMA emphasized that land valuation must be conducted by qualified professionals with a local market knowledge, often requiring collaboration between revenue department officials and certified values to ensure accuracy. And building valuation method, there are certain methods. First method is cost approach method, we generally use, which is the replacement cost method. So we calculate, first of all, in this method, we calculate the cost to rebuild the building with current materials and methods. And based upon this replacement cost, you will calculate the depreciation assessment. So here we have to make adjustment into this replacement cost for the age of the building, condition of the building, maintenance of the building, and then we will consider construction quality and disaster resistance, whether the building has better quality or medium quality, and what type of disaster resistance it has during constructions, and then you have to take into factors such as obsolescence and non-compliance with the codes. So the NDMA guidelines specifies that the building valuation must be performed using standardized cost estimation manuals published by recognized authorities like CPWD. This ensures consistency in valuation across different regions and prevents arbitrary assessment variations. So, though the values have been considering the effect of environmental in their valuation, but they hardly take into consideration the disaster specific factors which are affecting the value of the property. So NDMA guidelines recognize that disaster vulnerability significantly affect the property values. Property in high risk zone typically face valuation discounts that reflect increased insurance cost, potential for damage, and restricted development options. The vulnerability factors must be explicitly documented in the valuation reports. So vulnerability assessment conducted by qualified engineers or geologists often accompany the valuation in high-risk areas, providing scientific justification for adjustment to standard valuation formulas. So you know the property which are in Zone 5 or Zone 4, which are highly earthquake prone areas, or there are certain areas which are flood prone areas, cyclone zone prone area, landslide prone area, drought prone area. So you have to check whether the property falls in certain disaster prone areas and how this then you have to reduce the value of the property depending upon the fact which the building may be subjected to during some disaster. So for that you may have to take the help of some qualified engineer or geologist so that you can provide a scientific justifications for the reduction in the standard value of the property. So regulatory steps for construction and valuation as far as disaster management concerns are there. First thing is land clearance certificates. So obtain mandatory certification from the revenue department confirming that land is free from the encumbrance and legal dispute. Then for hazard zone verification, confirm property hazard classification through official maps of and NDMA zone designation. Then secure municipal authorization confirming compliance with the disaster resistant design requirement, and you have to check whether the person has taken occupancy certificate before entering into the constructed house. So receive the final approval verifying the construction meets all safety standards prior to the occupation. So these regulatory steps create paper trail that becomes crucial during post-disaster valuation. Properties without proper documentation often face challenges in receiving full compensation, as non-compliance with the building codes can be considered contributory negligence. So what happens is, whenever the bank gives loan to a person by hypothetically mortgaging the property or building, they generally get it insured. So many times when there are some disasters, so the affected person may ask for the compensation. So if their building has not followed the NDMA guidelines or other building bylaws and other requirements, then it will be difficult to get the full compensation as non-compliance with the building codes can be considered contributory negligence. So be careful when you are doing valuation to check whether the property is having compliance of NDMA guidelines. So this is a national disaster management guidelines. You can download it from the website of NDMA. which ensures disaster resistance construction of buildings and infrastructures which are financed through banks and other lending institutions. So each and everything is given in this topic. You can download it from the NDMA website. It is also available on our CEV website. You can download it from there also. And see here, the Reserve Bank of India has already asked the various banks to incorporate these things in their letter on long before, based on uh, 2011. They have already issued a letters, and you can get download the copy of NDMA guidelines of September 2010, and where everything is given. You can download these guidelines from the website, and these are also available on CB website. So the banks have many banks have issued these instructions to the values to provide that the specific relevance reference about the NDME guidelines they have been followed or not. So some of the banks they have also asked the borrower should also submit a certificate from the civil engineers regarding the compliance of NDMA guidelines with the approved plan for appropriate from the appropriate authority. So this is very important things which as a value you must consider, that whether the building which you are doing valuation is NDMA compliant or not. This now the this is a very old letter about 14 years back, but still now the banks have started asking for the compliance of this letter, and they have been issuing instructions to the values. Next is landmarking and site selection. So first is official demarcation process. NDMA has issued guidelines which require formal land demarcation by the authorized person before construction begins. This includes physical marking of boundaries, GPS coordinates, documentation, verification against land records, issuing of demarcation certificate, then high risk land restrictions. So the guidelines prohibit constructions in the areas with flood recurrence intervals less than 25 years, steep slopes having slope exceeding 30 degrees, active seismic fault lines within 15 meters, coastal regulation zone violations, and documented land history. So these are the things which areas which have been marked as high risk land restrictions, and the guidelines predict that the constructions in these areas cannot be done. So the demarcation process serves as an official record that becomes critical during post-disaster valuations. It establishes the legal boundaries of the property and confirms compliance with the buffer zone requirement around hazard features like river, fault lines, and unstable slopes. Then consultation with the expert. So mainly it is a structural engineers and geotechnical engineers which are expert in finding out that whether the building is NDMA compliant or not. So as far as structural engineers are concerned, they assess the structural integrity of the building, its foundational requirements, and check that whether it complies with the seismic codes and determine appropriate building technique for specific hazard zones. As far as engineers are concerned, they design the disaster resistant structures, incorporating safety features ensure buildings meet functional requirements while maintaining resilience. And geotechnical experts, you know what the geotechnical experts do. They evaluate soil conditions, ground stability, and potential for liquefaction or subsidence, recommended appropriate foundation system. So the NDMA guidelines mandate peer review of design for all the buildings and private structures exceeding specified height or occupancy threshold. These reviews must be conducted by independent experts not involved in the original design, providing an additional layer of safety verification. So basically, what happens is whenever you get the building designed from a structural engineer, then you have to get it vet from certain authorities, especially these are the faculties of IITs or NITs, which are authorized to vet the structural design done by structural engineers before the construction start for the buildings which are more than three-story buildings are having certain basement or any construction which is below ground level. So you have to take these things into consideration that whether the structure design of the building has been vetted by the competent authority before doing the valuation of high-rise buildings or buildings which are above three-story or which are having certain construction below ground level. So next are what are the NDMA guidelines for the site suitability for construction. First, there you must know what are the prohibited zones where the construction is totally prohibited. First thing is active fault lines. It must have 1.5 15-meter buffers is required from the active fault lines where the construction can be done. Then the building, the river floodplains with less than 5 year return period, coastal areas below high tide line, landslide prone areas having slope greater than 30 gradient, and filled pond or lake beds of which are less than 15 years old. So these are prohibited areas where the construction is totally prohibited. And there are certain restricted development zones where it can be constructed with some certain restrictions. First uh, zone is moderate risk areas requiring special building techniques. Then floodplains with 2 to 5 to 25 years return periods. Areas with poor soil bearing capacity. Coastal regulation zone 2 and moderate landslide susceptibility zones. These are certain restricted areas as far as NDMA guidelines are concerned. Then there are certain alternative land use areas, parks and recreational spaces, agricultural activities, ecological conservation areas, sports facilities with minimal structures, temporary seasonal uses with evacuation plans. So the NDMA emphasized that the land unsuitable for construction still retains value for alternative uses. So valuation reports must acknowledge these alternative uses when assessing properties in the high risk zones rather than simply devaluing them completely. So this is how you can do valuation. You can check that if the pro- property falls in any of these prohibited or restricted zones, then is it possible to have certain alternative use? So if it can be put to certain alternative use, then you can do its value or rather than simply devalue them completely. The plinth area requirements as far as NDMA is concerned, the minimum plinth area height above natural ground level for standard construction is 450 meters, and in flood zones it is 900 millimeter, and additional safety buffer above calculated flood level is 150 millimeter, means freeboard is minimum freeboard you have to provide 150 millimeter, and it affect the cost by at least 30%. So average cost increase in the cost over the flood compliance. So these are the plinth area height requirements for various conditions of constructions as far as NDMA guidelines are concerned. So what are the documents which are required for valuations under NDMA? First thing is, as you know, in first thing you must have the ownership documents, means land title deed, registration certificate, tax receipts, and mutation records, establishing clear ownership history of the property. Then you must have a survey record, means official land survey documents, site plans, boundary demarcation certificate stamped with the GPS coordinates. Then you must have approved structural and architectural plans and modifications, if any, with the official municipal sanctions. And then you must have compliance certificates, means building permits, occupancy certificate, fire safety clearance, and disaster resilience verification. So the NDMA guidelines specifies that incomplete documentation may result in provi- provisional valuation subject to verification or reductions for non-compliance. So property owners are encouraged to maintain both physical and digital copies of all the documents in secure disaster resistant storage. Assessment of existing structures, how you can assess that the existing structures they comply with the NDMA guidelines. First thing is visual inspections. You can visually identify the visible defects and damage indicators. Then you can do material testing. You can analyze the concrete strength, the steel quality, and the material integrity. Then you can do for structural assessment. So evaluate load bearing elements and reinforcement details of the structure. Then these things can be done with non-destructive testing as well as destructive testing. Mostly we do non-destructive testing of the structures for material testing and structural assessment of the structure. Then you have to check whether the building is complying with all the bylaws. So compare with the disaster resilience code requirements whether it fulfills or not. So the NDMA guidelines require comprehensive assessment of existing structures by qualified structural engineers, particularly for buildings in a high risk zone or those showing signs of deterioration. So these assessments form a critical component of valuation process as structural vulnerabilities significantly affect property values. Assessment findings must be documented with standardized forms and photographic evidence that becomes part of property's permanent record for future reference during disaster recovery evaluations. Then, what is the role of municipal authorities? There are two types of role. One role is to have regulatory functions, and second, during the disaster recovery process, they have to do the valuation of the buildings or infrastructures which have been affected by the disasters. The municipal authorities serve as frontline regulators for building safety and compliance. Their responsibilities include reviewing building plans for NDMA and BC compliance, issuing construction permits for disaster specific conditions, conducting site inspections during critical construction phases, maintaining hazard zone maps for and communicating restrictions. Then in the valuation, they have the role during the disaster recovery. Municipal bodies continue and contribute to the valuation by providing historical records of the property compliance, certifying pre-disaster conditions of the structure, validating construction quality against approved plans, participating in damage assessment committees, maintaining database of the property values for further reference. So the NDMA guidelines they emphasize that the municipal authorities must maintain detailed digital record of all the construction within their jurisdictions, creating a baseline database that becomes invaluable during the post-disaster valuation experiences. Next, what is the function of project management assess? So, what they do, they ensure quality assurance and they do inspection during construction, supervision during constructions, and they help in maintaining documentation. So as far as quality assurance is concerned, they implement systematic quality control procedures to verify compliance with the disaster resistant construction specifications and material standards. As they also provide continuous oversight of the critical construction elements, especially foundation works, structural reinforcement, and connections. And they also help in maintaining comprehensive record of construction methodology, material testing reports, and photographic evidence of compliance with the safety requirements. So the large-scale projects or public buildings, NDMA guidelines mandates that appointment of specialized project management agencies that act as independent quality monitors. These agencies create detailed documentation of construction quality that becomes essential reference material during future valuations. So the project management agencies are required to submit standardized quality compliance certificates that become part of the building's permanent record and must be considered during valuation process. Then occupancy certificates, it is generally issued by the local authorities. So at the completion of your house, you submit a completion application, a formal request for the compliance documentation. Then the officials concerned they will verify that whether the building adheres to the approved building plans, and they check whether the construction is conform to the structural integrity and the disaster resilience, and after that they issue a approval, official approval for occupancy for the building to be occupied for the use for it has been constructed and approved. So the NDMA guidelines emphasize that the occupancy certificates serve as the official confirmation that a building meets all safety and resilience requirements. Property without valid occupancy certificates face significant challenges during valuation, often resulting in reduced compensation eligibility. The guidelines recommended that periodic renewal of occupancy certificate, particularly in high-risk zones, to verify continued compliance with the safety standards and to document any modifications that must affect the disaster resilience of the structure. Next is what is the role of a National Building Code 2016 in this NDMA guidelines for valuation. You know, this is a basic code which contains all the constructional details and constructional practices, what should be the constructional practices, and what are the other things which are related with the construction of the buildings. There are different parts, what the main things which are important are which parts are important. First part is part 2, which deals with the administration, which establishes permitting procedures. It defines regulatory compliance process, outline inspection requirements, and details of occupancy certification. And then the part 3, which deals with the development control of the buildings, which specified front setbacks and buffers, which regulates building heights and coverage, which gives details evacuation procedure, and which addresses fire safety requirements of the building. And the part 7 of NBC, which deals with constructional practices, prescribes disaster resistance techniques, defines material quality standards, outlines structural connection details, and it specifies foundation requirements. So the NDMA Valuation Guideline reference NBC 2016 as the authoritative standard for determining building compliance. Structures are evaluated against these codes to assess vulnerability factors that may affect valuations. So non-compliance with the critical safety provisions can result in significant valuation reductions. Next thing as a value you must know as per the guidelines or as per the National Building Code or the building bylaws of the various states, in general minimum room size and circulation is as below. For bedroom, minimum area of the bedroom should be 9.5 square meter, minimum width of the bedroom should be 2.4 meter, and minimum height should be 2.75 meters. Living room minimum size again it should be 9.5 meters square, height width should be 2.4 and height 2.75. As far as kitchen is concerned, the size of the kitchen should not be less than 4.5 meters square, width should not be less than 1.8 meter, and height should not be less than 2.75. The size of the bedroom should be 2.8 square meter minimum area it should have, and its width should not be less than 1.2 meter, and its minimum height should not be less than 2.2 meter. As far as corridor is concerned, no minimum area is given, but minimum width should not be less than 1 meter and minimum height should not be less than 2.1 meter. Staircase minimum area is not given, but minimum width of the staircase should not be less than 0.9 meter and minimum height should not be less than 2.2 meter. So NVC 2016, these minimum dimensions are given to ensure functional adequacy and safety during emergencies. Buildings with rooms below these minimum may face devaluation during assessment as they fail to meet basic habitability standards. The guideline emphasized that inadequate room dimensions can impede emergency evacuations and rescue operations during disasters. So these standards also serve as benchmarks for replacement housing during rehabilitation projects, ensuring that the restricted and resettled populations receive accommodations that meets minimum quality of life requirement. Then, what should be the structural safety norms in the building? First of all, we will discuss about the earthquake resistance. So, NDMA guidelines specify zone-specific structural requirements, including reinforced concrete bands at plinth level, lintel level, and roof levels, vertical steel reinforcement at all corners and junctions, diagonal bracing for non-load bearing walls, ductile detailing of reinforcement connections, foundation ties, and ground anchoring system. And for cyclone and flood resilience, for areas which are prone to wind and water damage, the norms include wind restricted resistant roof anchoring systems, water resistant foundation treatments, elevated plinth with proper drainage, storm shutters for windows and openings, waterproof electrical systems above flood level, and rainwater harvesting and drainage infrastructure. So compliance with these structural safety norms significantly impact valuation assessments. Buildings meeting or exceeding these standards receive favorable valuations reflecting their enhanced resilience and reduced vulnerability to disaster damage. Then peer review of structural design. First of all, when the building has to be constructed, so initially complete structural design calculations and drawings are submitted by the primary engineers, including load analysis, material specifications, and connection details. Then these are to be reviewed by the independent expert. So qualified structural engineer with minimum 10 years experience performs comprehensive review calculations and assessing disaster risks. So basically this thing has to be done by the faculty of IITs or NITs which review these structure designs which are being submitted by the primary engineers, and then review engineer documents any safety concerns, code non-compliance or resilience weakness requiring modifications. So after all the corrections have been done, upon satisfactory resolution of all issues, reviews reviewer issues formal certification of structural adequacy and disaster resilience. So NDME guidelines mandate peer review for buildings above 15 meters, those with the unusual structural system, public facilities, and all structures in high risk disaster zones. So the review process caters creates documentation that becomes crucial during valuation as it establishes verified compliance with the safety standards. Then that was the things which have to be done before the construction starts. Then during disaster, what are the disaster resilient construction practices? So the NDMA emphasize that disaster resilience must be built into every aspect of construction rather than added as an afterthought. So these best practices not only enhance safety but also preserve property value through reduced vulnerability to the damage. So during valuation assessment, evaluators must specifically document the presence or absence of these resilient construction elements as they significantly impact the property's ability to withstand disaster events and consequently affect its market value. Then what are the technical steps which are to be taken during the valuation? First of all is initial inspection and documentation is to be done. So conduct a comprehensive site visit, document existing conditions with photographs and measurements, verify property boundaries. Then you collect the property data, gather ownership records, construction documents, previous assessments, and historical transaction data for comparable properties. Then you have to do this hazard zone identification, which is important, which is we have been ignoring this thing, hazard zone identification. So determine applicable disaster risk classifications from the officials and DMA hazard maps and local records. Then apply the standard calculation methods incorporating replacement cost, depreciation, and the things which is risk adjustment as per DMA guidelines. So the NDMA will emphasize that valuation must follow a structured, transparent process that can be independently verified. Each step must be documented with standard forms that become part of the official valuation record and serve as reference for dispute resolution if needed in the future. Then factors which are impacting the land value. First thing is zoning classification. So you have to check whether the building land it falls in residential, commercial, or industrial zone, and development density, permissions, allowed building heights, usage restrictions. You have to first of all check this. Then you this is the important thing which you have to check is hazard exposure. So official risk designation as a flood recurrence intervals, you have to check the seismic zone classification, landslide susceptibility of the area which you are doing valuation, and then you have to check legal restrictions as far as these NDMA requirements are concerned, such as coastal regulation zones, protected areas, and height restrictions. Then you have to check the availability of infrastructure such as road access, water and sewerage availability, and electricity reliability. So the NDMA evaluation guidelines require these factors to be systematically evaluated and documented with standard adjustment percentages. This ensures consistency across the different valuations while recognizing significant impact of these factors which have there on the land value. Then damage categorization. So as far as the damage categorization of damage is concerned, it has been categorized from G0 to G4 by the NDMO. G0 means if there is a 0 to 5% damage or approximately no damage, we can say that there is superficial hairlines crack in the structures or minor plaster flaking or non-structural statical damage or full functionality is maintained of the structure. So it is called non-damage and we generally record demo related with G0. So G1 is when there is minor damage, means there is a damage between 5 to 25%. So these are these damages may be non-structural wall cracks which are less than 5 millimeters, door window frames distortion, partial plaster separation, repairable without evacuations. Then U2 when there is moderate damage from 25 to 50% when the structural cracks are having width 5 to 20 millimeter when there is partial collapse of non-load bearing walls, foundation settlement is less than 50 millimeter and it requires significant repairs, then we call it as moderate damage. And then comes severe damage when the damage is between 50 to 75% means when there are major structural cracks which are greater than 20 millimeter, partial failure of the load bearing elements is there, and if foundation damage require underpinning, and then when if extensive reconstruction is needed, and then comes the collapse when if the damage is more than 75 to 80 100%, we donate it with G4. So when there is complete structural failure, building is unsafe for occupation, so it requires demolitions, and we where the full reconstruction is necessary. So these standardized damage categories established by NDMA provides objective criteria for post-disaster valuations. So each category corresponds to specific compensation percentage and reconstruction approaches, ensuring consistent treatment across the affected areas. Then we generally use replacement cost method for calculating the valuation of the property. So in case of building, when you are doing valuation with LDM, a certain adjustment has to be done. First thing is when you used replacement cost, you have to find out do the building specification analysis. So document precise dimensions, materials, finishes, and construction quality of the original structure using standard measurements technique. And then you calculate the current cost based upon the using the authorized rate schedules from the CPWD or state PWD and adjusted for local specific factors. And then comes this thing into consideration which we generally ignore, resilience enhancement costing. So add premium for disaster instant features required by current codes that may not have been present in the original structures. So solve is value adjustment. So deduct the value of recoverable material from the damaged structure that can be reused in the structure. So the NDMA guideline stipulates that replacement cost calculations must reference official government rate schedule rather than market costs to ensure standardizations. So local multipliers are applied to account for regional variations in materials and labor costs, creating a fair yet consistent approach. So then you have to apply on this depreciation based upon the age. You can apply any of the method, straight line method, constant percentage method, or other methods for calculating the depreciation. And NDMA guidelines incorporate standard depreciation schedule based on building age but allow for adjustment based on actual conditions. So well-maintained buildings may receive lower depreciation rate while the poorly maintained structures face accelerated depreciation regardless of chronological age. So effective age calculations consider significant renovations or upgrades that may have extended the functional life of the buildings. So values must document the evidence of such improvements through permits, receipts, and physical inspections to justify adjustment to the standards depreciation schedule. So now we will take certain examples that will make the things clear that how the compensation calculations are done. Let us suppose you have a property, a residential building, it is in a flood affected area with the following specifications. Built up area is 150 square meter. Construction type is it is a RCC frame building with the brick and fill walls. Its age is 12 years. Damage category is G2. Damage is 40%. It falls in G2 category. Then pre-disaster condition, it was well maintained. Document compliance with the building codes is available. Then how you will calculate, let us suppose for NDMA guideline for flood affected property. Replacement cost, let us suppose the replacement cost is 30,000 per square meter. So plinth area multiplied by replacement cost. So the cost of construction becomes 45 lakh. Depreciation for 12 year, we take the depreciation as 25%. So depreciation is 11 lakh 25,000. So the condition adjustment for good maintenance, this depreciation is reduced by 2 lakh 25,000. So let us suppose the adjusted depreciation is 9 lakh. Depreciated value is 45 lakh minus 9 lakh 36%. So damage percent is 40%. So the compensation amount will be 40% of 36 lakh, that is 14 lakh 40,000. So this example demonstrates how NDMA guidelines integrate multiple factors including size, construction quality, age, maintenance, and damage extent to arrive at fair compensation. Documentation of compliance with the building codes was a critical factor that prevent additional reductions that would have applied to the non-compliant structure. So let us take another example. The regional value of a commercial building pre-disaster market value of the property is 80 lakh. It has been subjected to a grade G3 damage grade, that is serious structural damage more than 65%. Then after assessment the value is compensation is calculated as 52 lakh, and then restoration grant, so additional aid for code compliant rebuilding, another 12 lakh is given as restoration grant. So this commercial building suffered severe earthquake damage due to its restriction location in seismic zone 4. The structure showed evidence of proper seismic reinforcement as per NBC 2016, which positively influenced the evaluation. The calculation followed NDMA guidelines for earthquake damage, including detailed structural assessment by certified engineers. The additional restoration grant was provided specifically for implementing enhanced seismic safety features that exceeds minimum requirements, demonstrating NDMA's commitment to building back better rather than simply restoring pre-disaster conditions. So if the person, the owner has done all the compliances, so he may not only get the required compensation of 52 lakh as in this case, he may also get 12 another amount of 12 lakh to reconstruct the building back better rather than simply restoring pre-disaster conditions. So this is an important thing which you must know when you are doing valuation, which we have been ignoring so far in our day-to-day work. Then next is documentation and reporting format. Next is what are the documents required for this type of valuation and what is the reporting format of valuation. First, you must have complete details of including unique ID of the property, GPS coordinate of the property, ownership information, and pre-disaster documentation status of the property. After getting all these documents, then you have to go for visual documentation, so comprehensive photographic evidence showing property from multiple angles with specific focus on damaged areas and measurement references. And then you go for technical assessment such as detailed measurement, construction specification, damage classification, and compliance evaluation with the applicable codes. And based upon all these things, then you have to prepare a step by step calculation showing all factors considered, adjustment applied, and final determination with clear methodology references. So NDMA guidelines mandate the use of standardized reporting formats to ensure consistency and transparency. These reports must be prepared in a triplicate with copies maintained by the property owner, local authority, and disaster management department for reference and audit purposes. So digital submission of reports to a centralized database is increasingly required, allowing for better tracking, analysis, and accountability in the compensation process. So, as far as the insurance linkages is concerned, first thing is the buildings must have mandatory insurance. So, building in high risk zones must have disaster coverage. Insurance prerequisites for housing loans in vulnerable areas. Coverage must align with NDMA valuation methodology and annual repairs of the insurance with updated valuation report. Then NDMA insurance coordination. So for this, you must have standardized damage assessment protocols, mutual recognition of valuation certificates, agreed terminology for claim processing, and joint inspection procedures for major disasters. So if the buildings are having compliance with all the building bylaws and codes, it may get premium incentives. So reduced rate for NDMA compliant construction, discounts for additional resilience measures, premium subsidies in high risk areas for lower income groups, and there may be certain good policy options for housing colonies. So the NDMA guidelines promote the integration of valuation and insurance system to ensure faster recovery after disasters. Insurance companies increasingly rely on NDMA certified valuations to streamline claim processing and minimize dispute over damage assessments. Then, what is the use of GIS and remote sensing in this procedure? So, you may have satellite imagery. So high resolution pre and post disaster imagery enables rapid damage assessment across large areas, establishing damage patterns and prioritizing ground verification efforts, then spatial analysis with the help of GIS tools, overlay hazard maps with the property data to identify vulnerability patterns and optimize resource allocation for both mitigation and recovery. Then there are certain mobile applications which the field teams may use, such as GPS-enabled devices to collect standardized assessment data, ensuring accurate location information and real-time database updates. And then data management. Centralized geospatial database maintained property records, hazard maps, and valuation history for during the future events. So NDMA guidelines increasingly emphasize technological integration for more efficient and accurate valuation process. Remote sensing enables preliminary assessment in areas that may be temporarily inaccessible following disasters, while GIS systems help identify patterns and anomalies that might indicate systematic issues requiring policy attention. Then, who are the stakeholders which are engaged in the valuation of it? So, what the NDMA guidelines emphasize? They emphasize that the valuation should not be a purely technical exercise conducted in isolation from the affected communities. Property owners have the right to be present during the assessment, provide relevant documentation, and receive explanation of the methodologies being applied. For vulnerable populations such as elderly, disabled, or economically disadvantaged groups, the guideline recommends additional support, including assistance in documentation, explanation of technical terms, and prioritization in assessment process to ensure equitable treatment. Then there are certain procedures for appeals and grievance redressal. So first of all, when there is some certain grievance, file written appeal within 30 days of the valuation notification, including specific objections and supporting document. So independent reassessment may be done by a senior value which is not involved in the original valuation, typically completed within 15 to 30 days. Then the appellate authority may grant a personal hearing with the review subcommittee to present evidence and clarify concerns. And then the written decision is provided with a detailed explanation of findings and further appeal options if applicable. So the NDMA guidelines establish a structured grievance redressal system to ensure transparency and fairness in valuation. This process recognizes that errors or oversights can occur in complex valuation process and provides an accessible mechanism for correction without requiring costly legal proceedings. So statistics from post-disaster recovery efforts indicate that approximately 15 to 20% of the initial valuation receive appeals, with about 30% of those resulting in revised assessments. So these five facts loop helps improve the overall valuation system over time. Then audit and compliance. So there are internal and external verifications of what has been done. So as far as the internal verification is concerned, NDMA guidelines mandate systematic quality control of valuation process, which includes random sampling of 10% of the valuation for detailed review, then supervisor verification of all high value assessment, then daily team collaboration exercise during a mass valuations, and photographic evidence requirement for all damage classification, and then dual signature authorization for final reports. So as far as the external audit is concerned, the independent oversight mechanism is there, which include third-party audit of valuation process, cross-verification between different assessment teams, State level oversight committees are there, periodic national review of compliance, public disclosure of aggregate valuation statistics, academic partnership for methodology review. So these audit and compliance mechanisms serve dual purposes, ensuring fairness to individual property owners and maintaining integrity of the overall disaster compensation system. The NDMA emphasized that transparent process build public trust, which is essential for effective disaster recovery. Then, what is the role of financial institutions in this? First, before the loan is disbursed, for they have to do pre-disbursement verifications. So banks and housing finance companies must verify NDMA compliance certificates before approving construction loans in hazard-prone areas. Then the lending processes mandate disaster insurance coverage aligned with NDMA valuation standards for properties in designated risk zones. Then special loans products for favorable terms for rebuilding disaster damaged property that incorporate enhanced resilience features. Then financial incentives are given for retrofitting of existing property to meet current NDMA safety standards. So the financial institutions play a crucial role in NDMA compliance by linking funding availability to adherence with safety standards. By integrating NDMA valuation principles into lending decisions, they create powerful economic incentives for disaster resilient construction beyond direct regulatory requirements. Then we will discuss about the state level applications. So NDMA guidelines provides a national frameworks that states must adopt and adapt to their specific hazard profiles and local conditions. States are required to develop detailed hazard maps at a higher resolution rather than national maps, identifying micro zones of vulnerability that requires special consideration during evaluation process. State disaster management authority translate NDMA evaluation principles into locally applicable standards that consider regional construction practices, available materials, and traditional building techniques. These adaptations must maintain core NDMA principles while addressing specific regional challenges. Then training and capacity building. So now there is a need of it. So foundation of 5-day training course covering NDMA evaluation principles, disaster specific techniques and documentation standards are required to be done, and the students, all the RVs, they can go for it and can conduct these 5-day training with the help of NDMA for doing valuation as far as NDMA guidelines should be done for all the listed and other values. So there must be advanced training in specific disaster types such as earthquake, flood, cyclones, and hands-on practice using standardized estimating assessment tools. Then these should be supervised by the practical assessment under mentor guidance with gradual progression from simple to complex valuation scenarios. So there must be some continuous professional development in these areas also, which will lack at present. So annual refresher courses covering guideline updates, new technologies, and lessons learned from the recent disasters must be incorporated in the training process of all the RVs. So NDMA guidelines emphasize that qualified valuers must have both technical knowledge and practical experience. The certification program combines classroom learning with field application, ensuring valuers can apply the theoretical principles in real world disaster conditions, must be done for the at least for the registered values. So the state authorities should maintain register of certified values who have completed the required training and demonstrated competency in assessment techniques. So only registered value professionals should be authorized to conduct official valuation of count for the compensation purposes. So this is all for today. Thank you for watching this video. Have a nice day.